Okay, I think people are entering the room at the moment, so I'm just going to give a few minutes just to let people arrive. But welcome to the Cambridge Festival's event. I can see numbers popping up in the participants, so people are arriving. Hello, welcome. The numbers still climbing. I'm just going to say just to start that I am joined by you can't see because of my background, but I'm joined by my dog who absolutely loves hearing about all things to do with writing, pedagogy and feedback and all the rest of it. I don't know why she's so interested, but she's here. Hopefully she won't contribute with a bark, but if she does, I may mute myself momentarily. Or if you see a sort of a head emerging from the background screen, that will be my dog. So I can see a few more people still arriving. We'll just give it one more minute just to see that people are here. I hope you're all having a lovely day wherever you are. I'm down joining you from down in Cornwall, where it's a little bit grey and overcast today, but it's better than it's been. All right, so I think I might get started because there's quite a lot of things I wanted to talk about because I think I'm assuming that everybody who is joining here today is also very interested in this question of feedback and how it's such an important part of teaching creative writing or facilitating writing, whether you're actually teaching it or you're somebody who's working with other writers and you're interested in ways to make that feedback as useful as possible, as valuable as possible. There's so many things that I'd love to say, and hopefully I'm going to get through everything. Yes, I see a couple more people arriving, so I'm going to get started. So my name is Lucy Durneen. I'm a teaching associate, a senior teaching associate on the creative writing programs at the University of Cambridge. I also am the course director for our postgraduate certificate in teaching creative writing. So feedback is one of my, I suppose you could say, one of my special interests. If you ever sit next to me at a dinner party, I will start at some point talking about feedback and how important it is that we do our very best to get it right, because I think we've probably all of us here in this room had experiences where feedback has maybe not been as positive for us as it might be. And I feel quite strongly that when we're teaching creative writing, it's a very vulnerable space that we're in. So thinking about how we give good feedback is really important. As well as being a tutor in creative writing, I am a writer myself. I'm a short story writer primarily, but I also write poetry and I write other short forms of creative nonfiction as well. I also work in other artistic disciplines like photography. I have my teaching hat on, but I'm also I have my writer's hat on, where I'm more sort of, in the space of receiving feedback, but I also do a lot of editing work too, where the kind of feedback that I might have to give is slightly different from the kind of feedback that I might give in a classroom. So what I wanted to think about today, because I don't know where everybody is joining me from, and feel free to put into the chat any comments about where you're coming from, the kind of work that you're doing with writers, so I can get a bit of a sense of how we're using feedback. I'm primarily thinking about how I might do this in a university setting. That's mostly where I work, but I also do community teaching work as well. Like I say, I do editing work, so I'm giving feedback on a one-to-one basis, and I'm a writer, so I'm always getting feedback as well. So I'm coming to this from all sorts of angles, and hopefully there'll be ways to share that in your own context. So that's where we are. So feedback. Why talk about this subject? Why did I choose to focus this session today all around the idea of feedback that empowers? Well, I think the thing with teaching creative writing is that we are coming from, as I said before, a very vulnerable space. Unlike so many other subjects and so many other places in which we might receive feedback, we are we're working with material that is very much, you know, it's personal, it's coming from the heart, it's it feels like a little piece of us. So when we're putting our work out there into the world, whether we're, you know, 20 years of experience or whether we're doing it for the first time, we're putting something of ourselves out there. And so getting feedback feels really well, very nerve-wracking, actually. In fact, I was talking to somebody only this morning about feedback on a critical assignment, and they weren't worried about that at all, but they said, would you maybe take a look at one of my short stories? And I'm really nervous about that, but I'd love you to do that. And so it's very interesting to me how in a critical space we might feel a little more comfortable with how feedback works, but when we're working with our creative writing, we feel quite differently. I was once told by a writing mentor of mine that all we have to do as writers is tell the story of the human heart, which is definitely not as simple as he made it sound. But because of that, I think it's why it makes feedback so particularly raw in this field. So I wanted to think about feedback that empowers us rather than makes us feel less than in any way. So I wanted this. I wanted to share a small clip from Strictly Come Dancing, which for anyone who might not be familiar with this show in the room, it's a dance competition. Celebrities are dancing competitively for the first time, most of them. And I wanted to share an example of the moment where one of the contestants gets some feedback on a rumba, I believe it is. They're not a dancer, they're a YouTuber. So this is not their comfort zone. And they just explained at the start of the dance how this was dedicated to their mother, who had not been, who was quite seriously ill, in fact. So it was a dance that was for their mother. So I'm just going to share this little clip. It's about 4 minutes long, and I'm hoping that the video is going to work perfectly. So let's just take a look.
Oh, that was so moving. A very special performance. Thank you, George. See what the judges think. Moxie.
Yes, George, first of all, I want to say thank you for being so vulnerable. It's never easy, especially a young man this day and age, to be so open with everybody. Thank you for that. And quite like careful about how you are on Strictly, and a bit, you know, yeah, careful. And I think you're leaning more and more in, and I love that. And I just want to say to your mom, I wish her all the best, that she's healthy and we can enjoy all this life together. That was actually a beautiful lyrical rumba. I love the lyrical parts of that. I love that it was moving and taking space. It's not usual that we see such an open rumba. The rumba section, I had a bit of a problem with the musicality. That's always for me when I'm just like, music is the number one. So it went off just a tiny little bit in the beginning and in the end of the rumba section. But as a feeling and the emotions behind the dance, this was really very, very beautiful.
You wanted to say that beautiful story for your family, for your mum particularly. And I don't think there's anything stronger than a son and a mum relationship. I'm getting all emotional. Let me calm down 1 second. I thought the whole thing, again, like Motzi said, was a beautiful lyrical feeling. It did go off a little bit with the synchronizing, coordinating. Alexis has already gone down before you went down. But other than that, and a few little bits when it came to coordination in the rumba, I thought you did absolutely wonderful. And I'm with Motzi. Sometimes it's about the music, the feeling, and the message. And you delivered it with all of you. Thank you.
You know, I really, really liked it. Let me start with that, because it's a sort of dance that I would like to do, and the dance I like to do. Do you know, years ago, I asked my teacher once about I always wanted to be the best male partner or dancer I could be for my partner. that was sort of my life's ambition. I wanted people to go, I wanted the ladies to go into the powder room and say, I had a dance with Anton. It was absolutely marvellous. You should have a go. That's it. That was my ambition. And I feel like that's you. I feel like you're the loveliest person to dance with in this competition. You're a wonderful, wonderful partner. You have a beautiful sensitivity of lead. Again, I don't want to talk about me, but I said to her, what's the most important component? She said, you must follow what you lead. And that you do this so beautifully. So you'll lead something here, but you'll follow it because you'll wait for Alexis to finish it before you ask her to do something else. And then you have this beautiful compatibility about your dancing together. So the musicality is so strong. And so your story is strong. I have to tell you, I loved it. Well done.
Right.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Ant? Technically, it wasn't great. I've got to be honest. You know what? It actually wasn't a rumba. So for me, it was difficult to judge. I'm supposed to be judging a rumba, and you danced a contemporary dance that belongs really in musical theatre. Admittedly, the story was absolutely magnificent. You told that beautifully. So you achieved that. So you will win the audience votes with it, but unfortunately, you won't win my vote. It just technically was not great. The hip action was just wiggling. It wasn't proper straight leg. It wasn't coming from. It was a salsa hip more than a rumba hip. I'm sorry to say, and I'm sorry that I'm the last one on this, but
It's fine.
it was a beautiful story. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much.
It was a beautiful story, and you've done your family proud, George. So
Okay. And move on from there. Right. Now, the reason I wanted you to see that clip, and when I first watched it live on Strictly, I immediately thought this is a really interesting example of feedback, because it kind of very neatly in 4 minutes just demonstrates so many different ways that feedback actually works. Especially again here, right, kind of akin to creative writing, the idea of it being a dancer when you're not actually a dancer puts you in quite a vulnerable space out of your comfort zone. But we had so many different examples there of feedback. We had the supportive, uplifting feedback from Motzi, the first judge, really identifying elements of what was working really well, and acknowledging also that it was part of a bigger story that was emotional and vulnerable too. We had from the second two judges, Shirley and Anton, we had a specific, very targeted element with an example of something that was working really well. The idea of leading to follow. I'm not a dancer, so that's new to me. So to see that sort of acted out, if you like, was a really interesting way to actually demonstrate what was happening, so that the feedback was meaningful and actually could be applied to something. And again, acknowledging where this was coming from, and acknowledging that there was two elements here. There was the story of the dance, the feel of the dance, but there was also the technical elements, which are the craft elements, if you like. But then we come all the way around to the final judge, Craig, who, generally speaking, I think is a wonderful judge and has lots of interesting things to say. But in this particular instance, I thought it was very interesting how, despite acknowledging that this was a dance that had great emotional meaning for the contestant, it was a very cutting kind of feedback. It was very framed in a way that only briefly kind of alluded to the idea that this was more than just steps in a dance, and sort of listed things in a way that to me felt quite crushing. Clearly the audience reaction was not very impressed either, but also then by his own acknowledgement at the very end, I'm sorry that I'm the last one. This is the feedback that you're going to go away with. The feeling you're going to leave this moment with is going to be one of negativity. And to me, that encapsulates a lot of the challenges and the problems of how we give feedback that truly empowers the person at the heart of what's really important here, which in this case would be the writer. So when we're teaching creative writing, what we really want to do is to be empowering the writer to be able to go away and take the next steps. And I thought this clip just kind of encapsulates all of the ways in which that might be challenging. Part of the problem really is, I think, that very rarely are we taught how to give feedback or how to receive it. It's not just a problem of how to transmit the feedback out. It's actually, how do we know how to make use of it? And that's the thing that I really want to sort of dig into today. Because actually, even just thinking about what feedback is perhaps a little more complex than we might think. We might think of feedback as being the specific response that somebody gives to something that we have presented them with. But as we might see, it can be a little bit broader than that as well. And what's really interesting to me is how we can use feedback to support the creative process. So often in teaching creative writing, we are in a workshop setting. That's a very common way for us to be giving feedback, but it might also be something that we're doing on a one-to-one basis. If we're mentors, for example, if we're editors, how we might write our feedback on a script. But also just as friends, if we have a friend who says, can you, I've got a novel, I'd really love you to read it, see what you think. Or you're part of a writing group that's a little more informal. How is the feedback that you are part of supporting the creative process of everybody involved? So I'm seeing people saying giving feedback in critique groups. Yeah, that's a very common one. That again, where we're not necessarily trained. I mean, I don't know where I've ever, thinking about it, where anyone's ever sat me down and said, this is a good way to give feedback, but also importantly, how to receive it. What even is feedback? I remember years ago, I was working at a university where we used to do regular student check-ins about how things were going. And one of the responses to this check-in was frequently, oh, we don't get enough feedback from the tutors. When we started to sort of ask students, well, actually, we think we're giving you quite a lot of feedback, we found that they didn't actually think of what we thought of as feedback at all. They were thinking only of perhaps what how much writing there was on one of their essays. But feedback is so much more than just simply the comments you might get on a piece of work. In the field that we're all working in creative writing, that feedback might come in the form of a workshop. It might be peer critique. It might be, something that you're doing in a small group. It might be with your friends. It might be with a specific writing group. It could be mentoring, as I mentioned. It could be more one-to-one. It could be the formal annotations that we might put. We might scribble in red pen on someone's work and make little notes in the margins. That's feedback. It might even be something like something more visual. It might be an image that you might draw in response to a piece of work. Or in the case of ekphrastic work, it might be directly a kind of a feedback to another image that we're, a new creative piece that we're working on is feeding back something to another image that we're inspired by, a visual image. It might be something as simple and kind of throwaway almost as the chat by the water cooler. We probably all know that experience where it's somehow in the informal moments that we really kind of get to the meat of what's happening. Often it's in conferences or seminars or workshops, it's when we're having a snack that we might really talk about how we felt about something or how much we enjoyed it or not. It could be in the form of questions in a discussion group. It could be oral rather than written. It might be in a formal setting like a school or university. It could be something like the actual grade. A number is a kind of feedback. And these might be ways that we're maybe familiar with some of them, less familiar with others, but perhaps, they all seem fairly obvious. They're explicit kinds of feedback. But feedback is also implicit. If I'm sitting looking at my watch while you're telling me something, you're probably going to feel a little bit hurried or a bit like, oh, you must think I'm boring, like you keep looking at your watch. That's a kind of implicit feedback that I'm not really fully engaged, and therefore what's being shared is not important to me. Similarly, maybe other gestures like rolling your eyes when someone says something, even if it's not directly to them. If they catch sight of that, that's a kind of feedback that you internalize. It might be kind of that encouraging, sort of that nodding, smiling, sort of, yeah, I'm with you, I'm here, I'm listening. Or other kinds of facial expressions. It might be a gasp. It might be something where you kind of, physically take a step back, and then it's a implicit sign that something has moved you or impacted you in some way. Something like an open mic, we typically click or clap or stamp our feet to indicate we're liking this. This is feeling really, we're engaged here. This means something. It's kind of feedback that performer can then, feed off, I guess. It can also be other things that are not so positive, like a kind of a loaded vocabulary, words that sort of sound one way but maybe mean something else, which we may or may not misinterpret. I've definitely had a situation myself where I asked for feedback from a friend of mine who is American, and he read the work and he wrote back and he said, this is a fine story. And if you are based in the UK, you probably know here in the UK, fine does fine is a strange word, isn't it? It kind of when someone tells you that something's fine, here in the UK, we don't necessarily think that means anything great. It might mean it's a little bit, it's all right. It's neither here nor there. It's nothing much. But my friend meant it in a way that in his context in the US, he meant it's a fine piece of work. This is a fine thing that you've done here. And I didn't hear that. I misunderstood what that comment meant. And that word was so important because it meant two different things in different places. So the feedback that I implicitly took was wrong because of a single word. And it also, feedback might be something like challenging someone's account of events in a story, which kind of implies that you don't believe it somehow. It can be a sort of a questioning of something, which suggests that there's a sort of a power imbalance here between the person giving the feedback and the person receiving it. And because what I'm interested in here is feedback that is more empowering, and feedback that is not just useful for us as writers, but actually really lifts us as writers. Some of these are the kind of the implicit feedbacks that I want to sort of draw attention to, because they can reinforce a sense that we're not being heard, that we're not being listened to. In more marginalized spaces, we might not feel like the feedback we're getting really listens and hears and understands what it is we're trying to do. And so it's really important, I think, to be mindful that these things that might happen that we might not even notice, these little micro feedbacks, if you like, are just as important to that empowerment or the sort of the removal of power from the situation in a not so positive way. They are just as present as the kinds of feedback we think of as more obvious. Now, this is something that really blew my mind the first time I heard this, that I was at a talk given by a psychologist, Naomi Winston, whose specialist area of research is in the cognitive kind of processing feedback. And she said, feedback is only information until you know what to do with it. And that absolutely blew my mind, because I thought I'd never thought of it that way. And it's completely true. Feedback is only information until you know what to do with it. And if you don't know what to do with it, then that feedback isn't really doing as much as maybe the giver of the feedback thinks that it is. So the question then is, how do we know what to do with it? I'm just noticing in the chat here comments on that kind of feedback, that sort of implicit feedback that can be, that we take on board and we feel it and we embody it. I think it's a kind of embodied sort of feedback or received feedback. So yes, interesting that others recognize that too. So to return to this idea of knowing what to do with feedback, I think the first thing that we want to do, empowering ourselves as writers and empowering the writers that we work with, is to know ourselves as a writer or an artist. If we don't know our own intentions for a piece, we don't know what it is that we're wanting to do, and we aren't building that sense of an autonomy, I guess, of ourselves as an artist, then we're going to be a bit more vulnerable to feedback not working out as usefully for us as it might. So it's a really important thing, I think. I always want to try and train myself to help the writers I work with to know themselves first, because then I can help my feedback and the feedback that I sort of facilitate around them to be in support of that. How do we know ourselves as writers? I mean, how do we know ourselves? It's such a huge question. But maybe we can stop and pause, and maybe you might want to do this where you are around the world. Why do you write? Maybe it's a question we don't ask ourselves enough. And if anyone wants to pop in the chat why they write, that would be lovely, but don't feel you have to. But it's a really important question. Why do you write? Once we start to ask ourselves why we're writing, we can begin to get ourselves into a place where we understand why the feedback that we're getting is going to be useful for us, and what that feedback might even look like. Why do you write? Got some lovely responses coming in here. To understand and to be understood, absolutely, yeah. To share something with the world, to metabolize lived experience. Yeah, it's such a processing, isn't it? Writing is something, again, this embodied thing. To tell emotional truths and make sense of things. We write to make sense of the world. We write to understand ourselves and our place in the world. So when we think about that, then, you know, it's a huge thing that we're doing. The feedback we get on that writing is really going to, it's going to kind of collide with that really sensitive and delicate space where we're kind of putting ourselves out there into quite a, you know, turbulent world to say something. And why do we want feedback? When we're thinking of knowing ourselves as an artist, this one I think is a really important one. Why do you want feedback? Because if we don't know why we're asking for feedback in the first place, then we're not going to know what to do with it. That information, as Naomi Winston said, we're not going to know what to do with it. Now, it might be that the feedback you're getting is part of, you know, a formal process. It's being in a workshop. It's going to, you know, being part of a master's program, and you're going to get feedback on your assignments. But if you're in a writing group, or you're asking somebody to take a look at your work, or you think, I want to engage in a mentoring program because I want to improve myself as a writer, understanding why you want feedback is really important for understanding, again, how to ask for the kind of feedback that's going to be useful for you. It might be that you want feedback to be heard. You just want somebody to read what you've written and to hear it. It might be that you want feedback because you really want to enter a writing competition and you want this piece of work to be the best it can be. It might be that you've got a goal in mind for a grade on your studies. Or it might simply be that you just want to learn how to express yourself in a way that other people can feel something of what you're feeling as well. Oh. So the next question that we might move on to then, when we're thinking about knowing ourselves as an artist, is how do you write? Rebecca Clarkson, who I quoted, knowing yourself, that the quote there, is a big advocate. She's a writer, an Australian-based writer, who advocates for understanding your process as a writer. How do you write? We all write very differently, and we all have different ways of getting the best out of our writing. I have colleagues who are fantastic at getting up early in the morning, and they get up and they write for an hour before going to work. Toni Morrison famously was up at, I think, 6 in the morning before taking the children to school to write. Personally, that does not work for me. I am not a morning writer, and I'm quite a slow writer. And I used to judge myself in that way. I used to think, well, everyone else is getting on with things faster than I am. But then I realized that my own process is slower. I write better later in the day. I can't write in short 20-minute bursts. I have to have a big sort of amount of time to immerse myself, to really lose myself in my writing. All of those things are absolutely fine. And once we understand our own process, we can honor that process. And so that means that we can build the feedback we receive into our process, and to recognize that it's not necessarily a negative comment on how we work or how we're going to develop our work. It's just part of our process And we can think about how to build the feedback in. So thinking about what your process is another really important part of understanding how feedback is going to work for you, because it's all part of that sense of understanding who you are, and what the piece of work that you're working on is going to, you know, how you want it to contribute to the world and how you want it to contribute to your creative life as well. Here's a really, really important one, I think. When do you want feedback? When do you want feedback? If you're anything like me, my writing process is very easily upset by the wrong word at the wrong time, or even a well-meaning question at the wrong time, or quite honestly, somebody coming in and asking me for a cup of tea at the wrong time. But when do I want feedback is understanding when is the right moment to get feedback is really important as well. When something is raw and in the midst of the mess of writing, feedback can be a very different experience from when it's polished, when it's ready to go, when you're actually tired of it and you just want now to let it go and let somebody else take the reins, if you like, and have a look. Particularly if you're working, for example, with an editor. When you're ready to let that piece of work go, it's ready perhaps for an editor to take a look, because getting feedback at just the wrong moment can either sort of overtly shape how you think things have got to be. You might want to start writing for somebody rather than for yourself. And feedback that's empowering is about figuring out what you want and not what somebody else wants for your piece of work. But it's also recognizing that feedback at the right time is going to take you to the next steps. Feedback at the wrong moment could potentially halt those steps. Stephen King puts it this way. He says, there'll be time to show off what you've done when you've finished. But even after finishing, I think you must be cautious and give yourself a chance to think while the story is still like a freshly fallen field of snow, absent of any tracks save your own. And that to me really, that speaks a lot to my own process. But also when I'm working with students, I don't want to be present in their work. It's not my work. It's not my story to tell. So the feedback that I will be aiming to offer is to help make that work the piece of work that they envisage for it in the best sort of possible way it can be. But there is this moment still where we're figuring out what that is. We're sitting with it. We're listening to the work. And we don't want to have anyone trample all over it. So understanding when the story is, or the poem or whatever it might be, is ready to be put forward for feedback is also very key to being empowered by it. And I would always suggest, for example, if you're working with very personal material, or if you're workshopping something, it's, you know, a personal essay, a piece of memoir, something that might speak to a traumatic event, that the time to bring that to external feedback is when you feel ready to speak of this and to be able to hear what people have to say about it. Recognizing that is so key. And so this, I think, also ties to this importance of understanding yourself. There's another self that exists in us as writers. There's, you know, we might be who we are moving through the world, but as writers, we sometimes become somebody else. We get to access a part of ourselves that maybe nobody else ever sees, especially if we're doing this for the first time. So it's important, I think, to listen to our own desires for the work. What is it that we want this to sound like and feel like? And then to think about how that might chime with the external feedback you're getting. And we'll come back to that in a moment to think about how that might work. But knowing what your own desires for the work are, so important. Because empowered feedback starts with knowing why you want that feedback, if you want it at all, and what kind of feedback is going to help support your writing at this moment in time. So empowering feedback generally, the kind I think that is most, and I'm trying to steer away from the words good or bad, because I don't know how helpful they entirely are, but I want to think about feedback that lifts us up as writers. So to me, this kind of feedback is rigorous. It's important. There's a spirit of generosity, I think, in being trying to make something better and not just saying, oh, I loved it, it's great, don't change a thing. I'm not sure that's actually as generous as it sounds, but it's curious. It's not assuming that we have all the answers as the reader, or that we know better as the reader. It's also precise. If you think back to that clip from Strictly Come Dancing, one of the bits of feedback was to give a demonstration of how something worked. So it was precise. It was you could map what that was to the actual to the dance itself there. I think it's also gentle. It's also, it doesn't have to be harsh. We probably all heard stories of workshops where people have ended up crying, and I can't see any way in which that's positive at all. It doesn't mean that workshop really got to the bottom of things because people left the room in tears. Sometimes there's almost like a weird point of pride in that, and I don't think that's very helpful at all. It's also something that should be centered on the reader. This isn't a moment, feedback isn't a moment to show off what you know as the reader, or to overpower a voice, or to think that you know better, and you've got this entirely different way of how this story or poem or screenplay should be told. It's to understand the readers, sorry, said centered on the reader, I mean centered on the writer. Very different. Very, very different. Centered on the writer, because that's who we're here to help, is the person who's writing the work. Now I'm going to come just for a moment. I want to give a bit of an example of a small piece of writing, and to think about how we might come to reading something with feedback in mind. But before I do that, I just want to see in the chat if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask here. Or anything that you're just wondering about at the moment. I'll keep an eye on the chat to see if anyone does. But I wanted to share a short flash fiction to think about how, and I think if I can perhaps ask Matt, who has a link to this, to pop the link to this story into the chat here. It's a story I want to share from the Bath Flash Fiction Award. I think it was from a couple of years ago that it was the first prize story. And when I'm encouraging people to give feedback on work, or when I'm giving feedback myself, I always think it's important to read the story twice. I can't remember who said that we should read once for pleasure and once for trouble, but I think that's a really good way of thinking of it. Once just to sort of feel how it feels to read it, and once to see if we can spot what's going on. The writer Robert Olen Butler says also that speed reading makes a legitimate response to a work of art impossible. So reading something twice helps slow us down a little bit. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read this story twice, but I am, I think Matt has popped the link into the chat. And you can follow along with the story there. And so you might want to read it twice later. But I'm just going to read it aloud here. And this story is called Snow Crow by Doug Ramsbeck. I'm just going to have to move my window so I can actually see all the story. And the days were made of auguries, and the cricket calls arrived disembodied from the field, and a dead mole lay on its back by the garage, gathering its thin blanket of ants. And wasps hummed outside the boy's window like primitive wraiths. And one morning he found a dead crow in the woods and carried it back to the house, hiding it at the back of his closet like a reliquary. And sometimes he imagined the creature calling to him in the night, calling to him in his dreams, and the boy would rise, pull the string for the closet light, and open the cardboard box. And there was the crow, its dark wings motionless, its dark and lacquered eyes gazing up at him. And sometimes in the mornings, the boy stepped into the backyard and gazed at the sun with its raw, sepulchral eye. And at breakfast, now and then, he asked about his father, and his mother would cross her arms over her chest or set his plate so forcefully on the table that the boy would look away. And some afternoons he sat in his closet and imagined the crow lifting itself on the dark oars of its wings, rowing high above the trees. Or the boy imagined a crow call fishing the air, a crow call that was both corporeal and incorporeal at once. And the smell in the boy's closet was like something secretive congealing on the surface of a pond. And on the evening, when a first light snow of the season came dropping toward the land, the boy carried the crow back into the woods and tossed it as high as he could manage into the air. So that's the story. As I say, you can have a read through the link and you can read it again slower than I'm reading it here. There's two questions that I like to ask before really entering into the feedback process. Read the work. And I want to ask, first of all, what happens in the story? Now, what happens is literally just that, what happens? That's the first question to ask. And that might be the first kind of feedback that we might want to receive. Do we understand what has happened? If you want to put into the chat what you think happened in this story, please do. I think what happens is a boy finds a dead crow. He takes it home, hides it in his closet. It starts to decay in the closet. Meanwhile, he's going to breakfast, he's going about his day. His mother's not very happy. There's some sort of tension between him and his mother. And then at some point, the snow begins to fall and the boy takes the crow out of the closet and returns it to the forest. That's what happens. That's the outline of what's happened in this story. But then comes the interesting question. What is the story about? Now, that might be a completely different thing. So the first thing is, as we prepare to give feedback on a piece, is to think about, do we understand what happened? Do we actually have a good sense of what happened here? But now, here's the other question, what's it about? If you want to pop in the chat what you think it's about, I would love to have a look there. So I'm seeing a response here suggesting that the boy is using the dead crow as a coping mechanism. Yeah, that feels like really strong to me when I'm reading a story, that it's a metaphor for some other kind of loss, isn't it? Yeah, the absence of his father and a mother who cannot or will not talk about it. The boy channels his unspoken grief and search for understanding into his morbid but tender ritual with the bird. That's such a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you to Alexandra for sharing that reading of it. So it's a story about more than just a bird and a boy. It's a story about grief, potentially, about loss, about letting go or struggling to let go of something. We're starting to get a bit of a sense of digging in. By being curious about the story, we're getting a sense of there being two layers to talk about. Not just what happens, but what it's about. And I appreciate that I'm moving forward fast because I have in this format, it's harder to sort of to hear back from you, but I want to give you some things to think about that we can pick up at the end with questions, and also for you to sort of take away with you too. So we've started there. Now I just want to sort of sidebar for a second to think about a problem of feedback and the feedback process, which is that, and this is a great quote from a book called Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback. Interesting, when we give feedback, we notice the receiver isn't good at receiving it. When we receive feedback, we notice the giver isn't good at giving it. And I think this connects back to something I said earlier, which is that we're never really taught about how to give feedback. So often, I don't know if you've been in a master's class or a creative writing class of any kind, you often will find yourself in a workshop. We are taught lots about craft of writing, but we're not taught about the craft of feedback. And suddenly there we are giving feedback, trying to receive it. People are sort of stumbling through. Sometimes we're more experienced, sometimes we're not. We've never really been trained. So it's a strange process, this kind of transference of feedback that doesn't always land as we think it's going to. And an interesting cognitive element of feedback is that how we process and remember it actually is kind of key to how useful and empowering it really is. Because one of the things about feedback is that our brains don't actually use it maybe the way we might hope it would be used. Research that was carried out by Naomi Winston and a team of her colleagues into how feedback is recalled revealed that typically we only remember 2 pieces of feedback after 24 hours. So they did some experiments to sort of demonstrate this, and if you're interested, I think if you look up Naomi Winston's research, you can find out more about that. But this is an interesting thing, that we can often overload with feedback, but actually 24 hours later, maybe only a couple of things stick in our minds. And often what tends to stick in our minds, because our brains are prone to this negative or an evaluative recall bias, it means that we hold on to the negative feedback, whether that's real or just perceived. And we hold on to the past oriented feedback over the future oriented. So what you didn't do, or maybe what you did do, but we typically end up remembering what we're told we haven't done, as opposed to thinking about what you might do next. So our brains aren't really working in our favor when it comes to feedback, because of this way we sort of we hold on to the negative. And I'm sure we've all got experiences where we can remember some feedback we were given, but because it was negative. I still remember being told when I was 15, my school report for English said that I was unwarrantably reticent. I have never forgotten that phrase, unwarrantably reticent. I can't remember anything else that anyone ever said about my work from school, but I remember that. So that's a key thing, a key challenge we have when it comes thinking about feedback. And this little table here talks about sort of the things we can do to, improve how feedback is transmitted. We can build a rapport between providers and recipients. We can enable learners to appreciate their active role in the process, knowing themselves. We can enable learners to overcome more defensive reactions to critical feedback. We can facilitate learners' focused action on the basis of feedback. These are all really valuable things. But as I said at the very beginning, we're working with creative writing. We're working with the stories of the human heart, and we are messy, complicated things. And this all sounds lovely and it's very useful, but often it's not quite that simple, I don't think, because, and I love this quote from an article by Holly Pester in her article, Pedagogies of Panic. She says, the classroom is full of people with people-like troubles and selfhoods like debt, love lives, fatigue, loneliness, deadlines, tenancies, contracts, social media pings, visas. They have bodies, clothes, appetites, ideas, distractions. An educator of creative writing is versed in encouraging students to write with these pressures and intelligences. This is the truth of it, isn't it? That we're in lives that are, right now, I'm sure, like, we're just bombarded with confusion and tragedy and difficulty, and the world is complicated and it hurts to be human right now, and all of these things are true. So when we're thinking about how we give and receive feedback, all of these things are playing out around us. Empowering feedback recognizes that those things are true, and that when we're giving feedback, we might be coming from a place where maybe we're worried about some of these things. We're worried about our economic stability right now. We're worried about whether anyone's ever going to read our writing. We're worried about how it might be interpreted because we've just shared something we've never actually shared in any way before. And when we're receiving feedback, those same worries, those same distractions are all present as well. So I think empowered feedback really listens to what Jen Ashworth calls it, the heart-centered sort of space of it all. It's the recognition that to give and receive feedback well means also to recognize the context in which we're receiving and giving it. So if giving feedback means empowered writers know what they want or need to learn about their work, we've already kind of figured out that we need to get a sense of why we want to get feedback. What might it look like? And you might want to try this later with that piece of that story that I shared. ask specific craft-based questions. And this actually is from the writer. This is the writer to the people who might be giving the feedback to them. This is what the writer can ask to make sure they get the feedback that they are needing. What did you read? So like we asked, you know, what happens in that story? What did you understand to happen in the story? What do you think the story is about? That other layer. What do you feel under the surface when you read that story? What did it make you think of? Were you confused? How did you feel? I don't know if anyone's ever read Felicia Rose Havez, The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop. It's a fantastic book that really sort of recenters how we might think about workshopping our writing. And she really focuses on going back to how a piece of writing makes us feel. Perhaps in the midst of all of the sort of technical things we might think about writing, we forget the emotional side of it. How did this piece of writing make us feel? And that might be something that a writer really wants to know. They might later want to know, is my tense working, is this like the best tense to be working in? Is my first person perspective the right one for this story? But they also might just initially want to know, how did you feel? Did it make you, you know, scared, happy? Did you engage with the character? Did you care about them? And then other questions might follow. Other thing, can you identify specific points where you felt a certain way? Can you be specific and precise? So when the writer asks these questions, they're going to start to focus the feedback onto something that really is useful for them. Now, the person doing the feedback giving, the reader of that piece of work, can also ask specific questions, rather than this idea of just coming in and pronouncing things. And I was always, when I was first writing, when I was doing my master's, when I was first teaching, everyone always talked about, you know, the praise, criticism, praise sandwich, or, you know, it has another name, which I won't say. You probably know what I'm talking about. That's sort of idea of the sandwich of the good and then the bad and then the good again. But that often leads to people making pronouncements and sort of making these statements about a piece of work. Asking questions means we get curious. We want to know things. We recognize that we're the reader. We don't know anything about this story yet. We're getting to know this piece. So they might ask questions about the title. Does it serve the story in any way or in the best way? Why does this piece of work start where it does or end where it does? What does the particular point of view that's happening at the moment, what does it allow for the story? Does it limit things? Does it mean we can't know things that we want to know because it's a perspective that isn't helping us see around corners or get into somebody's head? What do we know about the narrator or the setting or the characters? Do we have enough information? Do we know everything we need to know for this story to impact us the way it needs to? What was intriguing for us? What was confusing for us? These kinds of questions help us direct the feedback that we give to, again, be something that the writer can take away and actually think about. And think about actively as well. And this brings me to something I think is quite important, actually, which is something that I haven't always experienced, you know, in all of my time of getting feedback, is this idea of resisting solutions. I'm a little unsure these days about using Neil Gaiman as a source of information, but he did say something which I think is absolutely true, which is when people tell you something is wrong or doesn't work for them, they're almost always right. When they tell you exactly what is wrong and how to fix it, they are almost always wrong. And I think that's quite a sort of insightful glimpse into what happens when we try to give feedback. We can identify that something feels a bit off with the piece, or we're sort of, you know, we're not quite sure what to do here. But as soon as we start offering specific fixes, doesn't necessarily help. But asking questions means that the writer can go away, think about those questions, think about why the questions were asked, and figure things out for themselves. So this means that empowering feedback is more than just about the feedback, the actual sort of the words that are being used. It can be about the environment. It can be, as I said, it's about recognizing we might come to that feedback from a place where life is hectic and messy and scary, and we're not in the best frame to think about it. So we need to consider how the environment we're in might impact that. Is it, are we feeling comfortable? Are we feeling relaxed at the point that feedback is being discussed? How can we make people feel more at ease? Empowering feedback avoids assumptions about the work, and it avoids those personal questions that separates out the work from sort of whatever's behind it, and making it a sort of interrogation, if you like. Empowering feedback shouldn't be a display of knowledge or control. I think this is really important when we're working, especially where maybe the voices of our writers are more marginalized, or they're not being heard in the way that they should be. To come in and say, your work should look like this, or, you know, I think this is what you have to do, does not, it's not empowering, it's imposing. I think genuinely, I believe that empowering feedback is dialogic. There used to be this history of the idea of the gag rule when giving feedback, that whoever's getting the feedback shouldn't say anything while the feedback is being given. But isn't it important that that feedback is a two-way process, that questions can be asked, that it becomes a conversation and not statements? I think it's also really important to sort of make connections out as well, to see where there are parallels with other works, to think about how someone else might be doing this and how useful that could be. If you have a question about the writing, maybe reading another writer might help answer it. And I also think it's important to remember that empowering feedback is between the work and the person reading it. It's between the writer and the reader. It's not between you, named person, and the named person in front of you. It doesn't get personal. It's about the process, the act of writing. Empowering feedback, I think, is slow. Quick, off-the-cuff feedback can often be inaccurate. It can be a gut response, which isn't necessarily helpful. As I mentioned before, taking the time to read a story twice means that we can really feel the rhythms of it. We can feel what's going on with that story. It takes time to give feedback well. And it should also be thinking forward. What are the next steps? Where can we go from this? With an encouragement to do things wrong before we do it right. That's from Felicia Rose Havers, that getting it wrong is part of the process. Getting it right, I think if we're getting it right straight away, we're very, very lucky indeed. And how, you know, that's not necessarily the way it is for everybody. So being feedback, taking away those value judgments out of it. Is it wrong or is it right? Well, actually, figuring things out as we go along is part of the creative process. It's part of the power of what we do, I think. And I do think too that when we're truly empowering with feedback, the feedback should always encourage us to write anyway. It should never make us want to stop writing. It should never make us think, I'm putting down my pen and never going to pick this up again, and I'm not going to continue with this. It should always make us think, even if I don't agree with you, I'm still going to keep writing. I'm going to write this piece anyway, because otherwise what we've done is just shut down a voice, and that cannot be a good thing. So I've got just a couple more things I want to say before I want to come to the questions I can see in the chat and to open things up a little bit, because the final part of the puzzle in a way is how to receive feedback well, because it's one thing to give it, but how do we actually listen to it and make the best use of it? And I do think the first thing might be to question the use of the word receive. To me, that's quite passive, to sort of say, I'm just going to accept the feedback. I don't know that we have to. I think that going back to the idea of knowing ourselves as writers and knowing what it is we want feedback for means that we have a choice as to whether or not we use the feedback. We're also aware then of the implications of not doing that. It might be, if it's for an assignment or if it's in a school project, then it might be that, yes, the feedback is, the aim is to get you a better grade, and that might be what you want. So choosing not to listen to the feedback might be a choice to maybe not get a better grade. It might be that someone might suggest doing certain things might make something more publishable, and you might think, that's you know, my choice is to stick with what it is, and I'll take my chances. Personally, I've done that myself. I have been told that it would be easier to get something published if I made it a little more palatable, if I made it shorter, or if I change it into a different form. And sometimes I've thought, this piece has to be how it is. I have to keep it exactly the way I believe it to be. Not that I wouldn't change any element of it, but the essence of it. I believe in this piece, and I will wait until I find the right place for it. So we do have that choice, and it, you know, the outcome will be what it is, but keeping that choice is important. I think it's also important to check in that we've understood the feedback as it was intended. Like I mentioned with my friend who said that my story was fine, did not mean fine the way I heard it. So being sure that we've received feedback the way it was meant is important as well. And sitting with the feedback for a good while, at least 24 hours before we even do anything with it, really, really important. Because otherwise it's a kind of a gut reaction, or a sort of a sense we want to please somebody by making the choices, the changes that they suggest, or that we're trying to act on it too quickly. So spending some time, again, aligning the feedback with what we want for our work is important. And this one's a key one as well. Understanding permission and validity. Feedback should always be solicited. Now, I recently had an experience where I asked a friend, or a friend actually asked if they could read a story that I'd written, and I said, yes, absolutely, you can read it. It's, you know, it's still kind of a second or third draft, but yes. They read the story and then returned it to me all marked up with what they thought needed to happen with it. And I hadn't asked for that feedback. My initial reaction was very prickly, to be quite honest. I immediately bristled, thinking, I didn't, you know, why are you coming back to me with all of this? I just let you read it, and that felt like a big deal to sort of set this story free and let it be read. And aside, pretty much everything they said was actually right. And when I sort of sat down later and thought about it, I thought, yeah, no, they've got a point. These are things that will make the story better than it was. And I sort of, you know, put my ego to one side and worked on those changes. But in the first instance, I was not in the right place to receive the feedback because I hadn't asked for it. So understanding that permission is really important when it comes to feedback. And it's a kind of a space where we, you know, if we ask for it, again, being specific about what we want is really, really important. And finally, again, this idea that it comes back to the same point, that to receive feedback, an empowered writer knows what they want or need to learn about their work, which means that they can separate out multiple perspectives to align with what's going to help the work that they, as they see it. And the very final thing that I want to say before I hear from you all is that it's really, I think, sometimes when we're getting feedback, as I said, you know, our brains typically don't tend to retain more than a couple of pieces of feedback over time. We can often get bombarded in a workshop or a critique group. We might have 10 people giving us advice, 6 people, 20 people, whatever it is. Out of all of that, it can be overwhelming. So if we can find one useful thing to hold on to in the feedback that we're given, that feedback truly does become empowering. One useful thing that we can take forward with us might be about our broader steps as a writer, or it might be a specific thing about the work that we're doing at the moment. But reducing it to one thing that helps us to make sense of all of the different sort of ideas that we've been given, that to me is more valuable even than sort of, you know, multiple perspectives. But sometimes we need those multiple perspectives to be able to filter out what the most useful or the common kind of observation is. So that's a lot of stuff that I've shared with you over the last hour, and I do see lots of sort of things popping up in the chat that I want to be able to get to if I can. So thanks for listening to that part of things, and I hope that I've kind of, you know, sort of touched on it. Does feel like touching on things that might be things to explore, but to give you some things to think about. So in the chat, I see here a question. If you have suggestions for solutions you'd hope could help, is there any point when you should say them? Yes, I do think that resisting solutions doesn't mean not offering any possibilities. I think it's that sort of feeling of, if you just do this, or you know what you should do, you should change it to third person or something like that. I feel like when it's kind of a pronouncement or something absolute, it can feel a bit more like you're someone's taking control over your piece. But if you've got sort of if you think, oh, what if we started the story at paragraph 2? What would be the impact of starting it there? How would that work? And then what that means is, by framing it as a question, that goes back to the writer, who can sort of think, yeah, what if why might that be an interesting place to start? Maybe it is actually a good place. By framing it as a question, it's not a solution as such, but it is it's opening up that possibility for how could this work differently, and it is being curious. It's about being, it sort of also, I think, shows a kind of a generosity of like how you've engaged with this piece. You've really thought about it. So that would be my response to that question about if you think you can see something that you think might be useful for the piece, frame it as a question, put it back to the writer, let them work through that possibility, and then I think that helps open things up without feeling like it's someone coming in and saying, I know better. So this is an interesting comment here about I found stepping away and focusing with the student on the specific writing task and feedback steps can be more empowering. Yeah, listening to the person you're working with, absolutely. Also understanding directly what it is that they want to achieve and where things are maybe getting stuck, or what's getting too loud around them to be able to see their way through the work. That, I think, again, really does help focus and empower, definitely. Another question here. I'm quite tough-skinned when it comes to feedback, and I want to know everything so that I can consider it and improve. I sometimes worry that when I give feedback, sometimes someone will receive it as being harsher than I intend it to be. That's such an interesting thing, because it just reinforces how we all want and need feedback differently. So in a way, there's like two parts there for me. I would say that if we're quite tough-skinned, and I personally prefer feedback that's quite direct and helpful when I've asked for it. I think when we're receiving feedback, we can set those parameters. We can be like, yeah, you know what, can you be as brutal as you like, just get right in there. That's what I want. I want no messing around, no nonsense. Just tell me what you think needs fixing. And then, because you've asked for that, then it means that the people giving feedback can lean into that. If you're asking the same questions of the people you're giving feedback to, if you say to them, what kind of feedback do you want? Do you want me just to read it for feeling? Do you want me to read it for problems? Do you want me to read it for line level edits? If you ask them what they want, then you can provide what they want. And sometimes somebody just wants to, as I said, they want to just have something read to be heard. And if you know that, then we can hold back on the feedback and just say, yeah, I read it, and it's so it's so interesting to see this story being told, whatever it is you might want to say. So finding out what kind of feedback the person is comfortable with receiving, I think, can be really helpful there, so that we can inadvertently avoid inadvertently being harsh. And also sometimes we are harsher, things come out harsher than we mean them to, or we choose a word that we think is great and it doesn't land in the same way. And I think, as with everything, it's if that happens, it's just recognizing it and saying, I'm really sorry, I did not mean it that way, and getting a good dialogue going, which is why when feedback isn't dialogic, it can be harder, because we don't know how it's been received. So I think we are almost drawing to a close, because I think we were sort of we were a little flexible on time, but I think we were bringing things to an end sort of around about 1/4 perhaps. So I've got maybe time for a couple more things, which I can see some things in the chat. So I'm just having a read through this question here. So someone asking for line edits because the comments helped learn how to improve sentences. What do you do if the writer is asking, what the writer is asking for differs from what you'd normally offer at a certain stage? I'm wary of the shaping that you referred to earlier. Absolutely. Again, you know, I think it's about communicating because, as I say, when the whole kind of feedback dynamic is something that I don't think we get an awful lot of instruction in. And so sometimes we don't know what to ask for or what to sort of, you know, say our own limits. When we're giving feedback in a mentoring kind of capacity, it can be helpful, I think, to sort of set up from the beginning. Maybe we do structural work, but we don't do line edits. Maybe that's something we're not so comfortable with doing. Or if we don't typically do that, again, being clear that that's maybe something a little different from normal for that particular dynamic. But if you're in conversation with that writer and thinking about what is it they need, it's lovely that this writer was feeling that the comments were really helpful at sentence level. So that tells you that this is a piece of work that is definitely benefiting from that kind of granular, really kind of close attention to individual elements. And for some writers, that is more helpful than the broad strokes, you know, the kind of the figuring out the structure or figuring out like the bigger plot or those kind of questions. So I think recognizing that line edits can be really useful for some people, but they are only suggestions. So that shaping, that question of not wanting to sort of put your own imprint onto something, you know, we probably all read the things about, like, you know, Gordon Lish and Raymond Carver, where Gordon Lish's edits were really intrusive and really changed the voice of Carver's work. I think by being kind of clear on the limits and stepping back from anything that might be seen as starting to change the work, I think that's really important. But also finding out what part of those line edits was the helpful parts. Is it about correcting things, which might be a very different kind of editorial job from feedback, from board feedback, but also is it about giving confidence? And are there other ways that you can build confidence for that writer so that they trust their own inner editor? They start to develop that sense of being able to sort of improve the lines individually themselves. So I'd say it always comes back to conversation. And sometimes with feedback, we don't have those conversations because there's an assumption that everybody knows what's what. So yeah, always keep talking with feedback. I am just seeing there are some other questions, but we are probably, I'm just wondering, Matt, how we're doing for time, if you want to let me know how we're getting on. I can see a question about giving feedback to material that you've interpreted differently from what it was intended to mean. Again, that's where that question right at the beginning, when I was talking with the sample story of what happens and what's it about, that's really valuable. If we start there, then we can quickly find out if we've interpreted something differently. So when we say what happened in a story, and it can be really useful to sort of almost just say that back to the writer, this is what I think happened. And then they can straight away be like, actually, that's not what's happened. If you then get to the next question of what's it about, and again, there's a sort of a discrepancy there, then the interesting questions, and again, their questions become, why did I think this when you wanted me to feel that? So with the writer, if the writer has the kind of questions that are specific about how you understood the story, and the feedback giver, the reader, has specific questions that sort of ask about why certain things are happening, then you can still give feedback even where there's been a different interpretation, because then it becomes clear somewhere along the way something didn't quite translate, but it's all being explored in this, in a curious and a supportive and a way that doesn't indicate that the story hasn't worked or that the poem hasn't worked, that something's gone wrong. It's more just, how can I hear better what's happening here, and where did I go off piece, where did I get distracted and get lost? So questions, I think, are really helpful, but going back to that basic, what happened, what happens, and what's it about, can be really useful. All right, so I think we're pretty much out of time now. I am so happy to have so many comments and questions in the chat here, and I think at the very start of the chat, Matt might have put some links to how you can get in touch with me if you would like to ask further things. I'm going to stick my email into the chat now also, so that if anyone has any other questions or would like to chat about feedback, then they can do that. And I apologize if I've missed people. I'm sure I have, because there's just so many things happening in this chat, which is brilliant. But I wish you all great words and great writing, and support with the feedback that you're giving others as well. And yeah, what a great community of writers we have here attending. So thank you all for coming along, sharing your afternoon from all over the place. It seems I see people joining from all over the world, so that's fantastic. Okay, thank you. I'll put the email back in again for there we go. It's lcd48@cam.ac.uk for anyone who can't see it in the chat there. All right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.